Early morning at Sunny Plain Ranch began, as always, with the first rays of the sun gilding the hills and awakening the birds. Carolyn woke up earlier than usual, feeling an inexplicable unease. At this hour she usually heard the muffled neighing of Bo, her old chestnut gelding, who had been part of their family for 20 years. But today there was an anxious silence outside the window. Throwing a quick glance in the mirror and putting on a thick flannel shirt, Carolyn rushed out into the yard. Her boots slapped against the dusty ground as she ran to the enclosure. She stopped, barely catching her breath, when she saw Bo lying on his side. His chest rose with difficulty, his breathing was hoarse, and his eyes were dull. "Bo!" she whispered softly, approaching him. Her voice trembled. She carefully knelt beside him, placing her hand on his sweaty neck. "Are you okay, buddy?" The horse did not respond with his usual neigh. He barely twitched his ear, as if understanding her words, but Bo had no strength to even lift his head. "Dad!" Carolyn shouted towards the house. "Dad, come quick!" A few minutes later her father, Samuel, came out of the house. In his hands was an unfinished coffee, and his gaze was concerned. Carolyn rarely called him with such urgency. "What happened?" he asked, approaching the fence. His face immediately darkened when he saw Bo. "He's barely breathing," Carolyn said, barely holding back tears. "We have to do something." Samuel slowly nodded, squatting down to assess the horse's condition. His face showed that heavy thoughtfulness that Carolyn had always hated since childhood. She knew. Her father was considering the worst scenario. "We'll take him to Dr. Graves," he finally said. "Gather everything, I'll prepare the pickup." The trip to the vet was long and tense. Bo lay on the platform covered with a warm blanket. Carolyn whispered words of support to him throughout the journey, although inside her, fear reigned. She couldn't imagine her life without him. Bo was her friend, her comfort, and a living reminder of her mother, who had given him to her on her 10th birthday. Dr. Graves met them at the gates of his clinic. The elderly man with thick gray hair and piercing eyes slowly approached the pickup, carefully examining the horse. He immediately noticed that something was wrong. "Let me help you get him down," he said, pointing to his assistants. When Bo was carefully transferred to the barn, Dr. Graves began the examination. Carolyn stood nearby, nervously fidgeting with the sleeves of her shirt. She did not take her eyes off the horse, catching every movement of the veterinarian. "Carolyn," Dr. Graves finally said after a long silence. His voice was soft, but there was a heaviness in it. "I'm afraid it looks like a tough battle ahead." "What's wrong with him?" she asked, looking him in the eye. The doctor paused for a moment as if choosing his words. "He has been diagnosed with chronic myositis," he began, continuing to speak confidently and calmly. "It's an inflammation of the muscles that can be caused by an autoimmune process. In his case, the disease has progressed too far. It's a rare and, unfortunately, incurable condition in horses. It causes constant pain and weakness." Carolyn felt her heart sink. She swallowed, trying to digest what she had heard. "But you can do something, right?" Her voice trembled. "Medicines? Surgery? Anything?" The doctor shook his head. "Medicines can only temporarily relieve his condition. But Carolyn, you must understand." He paused. "The best thing we can do for Bo is to relieve his suffering." "Are you suggesting putting him down?" she challenged. "It's the most humane way out," the doctor confirmed, looking at her sadly. "I know it's hard, but it's for the best." Carolyn abruptly turned away, not wanting to listen to his arguments. She knew that Bo was fighting, but something inside her screamed not to give up. "No," she said firmly. "I'll take him home." Dr. Graves sighed, understanding her stubbornness. "If you really want this," he said, handing her a sheet with recommendations, "I'll help you. But be prepared. Caring for him will be difficult. It will take all your time, and the chances are still slim." "I'll manage," she replied, not averting her gaze. "I won't let him go like this." That same night, Carolyn brought Bo back to the ranch. She arranged his stall, laid out a soft bed, prepared warm water, and the medicines prescribed by the doctor. Her hands trembled from fatigue, but she continued to work. "We'll make it, boy," she whispered, running her hand over his neck. "I promise." Bo looked at her with his tired eyes, in which a spark of life still flickered. Every morning, Carolyn woke up before dawn. She was tired, but she paid no attention to the fatigue. All her time and energy went to Bo. She monitored his condition, gave him medicines, massaged his muscles, and even read about new therapy methods. Bo was weak. Sometimes he didn't even try to get up, lying on the straw bedding. In such moments, Carolyn felt that the struggle was futile. But as soon as she saw him slightly move his ear or try to lift his head, hope returned. Samuel watched from the side, keeping his opinion to himself. He knew that arguing with his daughter was pointless, especially when she was so determined. But it was hard for him to see her exhausting herself for the old gelding. "Carolyn," he said one day, entering the barn where she was finishing her morning procedures. "Are you sure this is right?" She looked up at him with tired eyes, but in them the fire of determination still burned. "If I don't try," she replied, placing her hand on Bo's neck, "I'll never forgive myself." Samuel sighed, understanding that the answer had long been obvious. 2 weeks passed. Bo seemed to be getting weaker. He rarely stood up and often refused food. Carolyn knew these were signs that the disease was progressing, but she didn't allow herself to give up. One of the toughest moments for her was deciding to hire a horse physiotherapist to try to stimulate Bo's muscles. This required money, which the ranch was already short of. She argued with her father for a long time until she convinced him that it was necessary. "We can't afford this," Samuel said firmly one evening as they sat on the porch. "The ranch is already on the brink." "This is important, Dad," she insisted. "I'll find a way to pay. I'll sell my jewelry if I have to." Her words struck Samuel. He saw that his daughter was willing to do anything for Bo. After a long pause, he simply nodded. The physiotherapist arrived a few days later. A young woman named Rachel explained to Carolyn the basic techniques: massage, light exercises, muscle stimulation with special devices. It all looked promising, but the results promised to be long and gradual. "The main thing is patience," Rachel said, watching Carolyn repeat the massage movements. "Bo feels your care. This could be the deciding factor." Carolyn nodded, trying not to show her doubts. She had patience, but the fear of the inevitable still lived deep inside her. A month passed. Bo began to stand up a little more often, albeit with difficulty. His appetite improved, and his gaze became more conscious. Carolyn noticed these changes and was inspired. Every day she repeated the exercises, talked to him, told stories from her childhood, as if she wanted to remind him what he was fighting for. But not everything went smoothly. There were days when Bo refused to move, and his breathing became so heavy that Carolyn thought the end was near. In such moments she closed her eyes, clenched her fists, and whispered, "You're strong, Bo. You can do it. We can do it together." Samuel, seeing her struggle, began to spend more time in the barn, and sometimes even offered to replace her so she could sleep. Carolyn initially refused, but then realized that his support was important. Bo continued to fight. Carolyn believed that a miracle was possible, even though the veterinarian warned that the chances were slim. 3 months had passed since that morning when Carolyn first noticed that Bo was not well. These were the longest 3 months of her life. Each week seemed like an eternity, and each morning began with anxiety. Would today be worse than yesterday? But small victories began to instill hope in her. Bo could now stand up on his own, although it took a lot of time and effort. His eyes began to shine again, and sometimes he even tried to walk around the stall. Carolyn noticed how he raised his head when she entered the barn, and one day he even neighed softly when he saw her. These little signs made her smile despite the fatigue. One of the most significant days was when Bo took his first few steps on his own. It happened early in the morning. Carolyn, as usual, came to the stall with a bucket of warm water and fresh hay. When she opened the door, she froze. Bo was standing on his 4 legs, swaying, but steadily holding himself. "Bo!" she exclaimed, rushing to him. "You did it. You stood up." Tears rolled down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. Bo, as if understanding that she was proud of him, took one uncertain step, then another. and then, exhausted, lay down on the bedding again. But that was enough for Carolyn to believe that they were moving in the right direction. When Samuel found out about this, he smiled for the first time in a long time. "It seems your stubbornness is starting to bear fruit," he said, patting his daughter on the shoulder. "You're doing the impossible." However, the struggle was far from over. Carolyn knew that Beau's recovery was a long journey, and every improvement could be temporary. The veterinarian was still skeptical. When Dr. Graves examined Beau again a few weeks later, he slowly shook his head. "I admit I'm surprised," he said, writing something in his notebook. "I thought he wouldn't last a month. But Carolyn, you need to understand that the disease hasn't gone away. This is just a remission. He's still very vulnerable." "I understand," she replied, clenching her hands. "But I believe we can do more." The doctor looked at her with sadness but did not argue. He saw that her determination was unyielding. The family became closer thanks to the struggle for Beau. Samuel began to help Carolyn more often, and her younger brother Jamie, who came home from college for the weekend, decided to stay for a month to support his sister. Together, they set up a special paddock in the open air so that Beau could spend more time outdoors. "This will be his training ground," Carolyn said, watching Jamie reinforce the fence. "Let him relearn how to walk." Beau, although with difficulty, began to go out for walks. At first he only took a few steps, but every day his confidence grew. One day he even made a full circle around the paddock, and Carolyn watched this with pride. "You're doing it, boy," she whispered, watching him walk in the morning sun. "I knew you could." Nights were still tough. Sometimes Carolyn woke up from the sound of Beau's heavy breathing, and her heart tightened with fear. But she would take a flashlight and go to him to make sure everything was okay. Beau seemed to find comfort in her presence. Every time she was near, his breathing became calmer. Carolyn realized that their bond had become deeper than ever. Beau was no longer just a horse to her. He had become a symbol of her resilience, her faith that love could overcome even the scariest things. By the end of the 3rd month, an event occurred that finally convinced everyone that Beau was not giving up. Early one morning, when Carolyn brought him to the paddock again, he suddenly raised his head, shook it, and ran. These were only a few steps, but they were fast and confident. Beau found the strength to move again. Carolyn stood, pressing her hands to her mouth, unable to believe her eyes. "Dad! Jamie! Come quick!" she shouted. Samuel and Jamie rushed out of the house as soon as they heard her call. They froze, watching Beau make slow circles around the paddock. "This is unbelievable," Jamie whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "Carolyn, you were right. You did it." Carolyn, in tears, looked at Beau. This was not just a moment of joy. This was a moment that proved the struggle had meaning. Beau not only survived but also began to overcome his illness. And although there were still many days of rehabilitation ahead, Carolyn knew one thing. Miracles are possible. Beau had proven it. By the 4th month, the struggle for Beau had become an integral part of life at Sunny Plain Ranch. Carolyn had grown accustomed to tense days and almost sleepless nights. However, now hope had taken the place of fear. Each day brought small improvements, and Beau, although slowly, was recovering. His steps became more confident, and his appetite returned. The family began to believe in the miracle. Even Samuel, who initially considered the treatment futile, began to devote more time to the horse. He even insisted on expanding the paddock so that Beau would have more space for training. "This place should be comfortable for him," he said one day, tightening a bolt on a new section of the fence. "If he decided to fight, then we should help him." Carolyn looked at her father in surprise. Her strict and sometimes cynical parent had changed. She saw that Beau had become more than just an old horse to him, a symbol of something greater, hope in the most difficult situations. One of the most important events was Beau's first full walk outside the paddock. Carolyn decided it was time to take him to the river, where he used to love spending time. This was risky, but she felt it would help him regain confidence. Samuel and Jamie accompanied her, just in case Beau got tired. The horse cautiously stepped over the grass, each step requiring effort, but he did not stop. Carolyn walked beside him, holding his halter, and spoke softly to him. "You're doing great, Beau," she said. "I'm proud of you." We're almost there. When they reached the river, Bo stopped and raised his head. His nostrils flared, inhaling the scent of water and fresh grass. Carolyn noticed how he relaxed. This place seemed to awaken old memories in him. Come on, buddy, she whispered, gently nudging him forward. And Bo did something no one expected. He lowered his head to the water and began to drink. This was a simple moment, but for Carolyn it meant everything. Bo had returned to what he loved, and this was the first step in his full rehabilitation. Despite the successes, there were still difficult days. Sometimes Bo became lethargic again, and Carolyn feared the disease would return. These moments exhausted her morally, but she continued to fight. Her family supported her, especially Samuel, who was now there not only physically but also emotionally. You know, he said to her one evening, sitting on the porch with his daughter, I didn't think this was possible. I wanted you to give up. But I'm proud of you. You taught me that sometimes it's worth fighting to the end, even if the chances are slim. Carolyn smiled, listening to his words. This was the moment she had long waited for. Her father recognized her strength and determination. A few weeks later, Bo took his first full gallop in the paddock. This was a real event. Carolyn, Jamie, and Samuel watched as the old gelding picked up speed, his hooves leaving the ground, and his mane flowing in the wind. This was a moment of triumph, a symbol of their shared victory. Carolyn stood by the fence, her hand on her heart, unable to hold back tears. Bo had shown that even in the most difficult circumstances, hope could prevail. We did it, boy, she whispered when Bo approached her and nudged her hand with his muzzle. You proved that miracles happen. That evening the family gathered for dinner, something that hadn't happened in a long time. Samuel brought out a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion and raised a toast. To Bo, he said, smiling, and to Carolyn, who showed us that love and persistence can work miracles. Jamie added, and to all of us. We all fought together. Carolyn raised her glass of juice, smiling. This moment was confirmation for her that her struggle had not been in vain. Bo was not just recovering. He had given their family unity and faith in a better future. 6 months after the battle for Bo's life began, Sunny Plain Ranch had become a place talked about not only in the county but also beyond. The story of the old chestnut gelding, who miraculously returned to life, became known thanks to Rachel, the physiotherapist, who told it to her colleagues and friends. Gradually, people began to come to the ranch to see Bo and learn how Carolyn had accomplished the impossible. One sunny Sunday afternoon, the ranch gates creaked, and a woman in her 40s with a little girl approached the house. Carolyn, who was cleaning Bo's stall at the time, noticed them and went out to the porch. Good afternoon, the woman said, smiling. You must be Carolyn? Yes, that's me, the girl replied, wiping her hands on her apron. How can I help? The woman briefly glanced at the little girl before continuing. I heard your story from Rachel. My daughter Ellie lost her pony a few months ago, and she still can't get over it. I thought that maybe seeing your Bo would help her. Carolyn looked at the little girl. Her eyes were big and sad, and she clung to her mother's hand as if afraid to let go. Of course, Carolyn said, warmly smiling. I'll take you to him. When they approached the paddock, Bo was standing under a tree, lazily swishing his tail. But as soon as he heard Carolyn's footsteps, he slowly walked towards them. Ellie froze, seeing the big gelding. Carolyn noticed how her lips trembled, as if she wanted to say something but didn't dare. He doesn't bite, I promise, Carolyn said, squatting next to the little girl. Would you like to pet him? Ellie timidly nodded, took a step forward, and carefully reached out her hand. Bo stood still, patiently waiting for her small fingers to touch his muzzle. Is he not sick? Ellie asked, looking up at Carolyn. He was very sick, Carolyn replied. Very badly. But he fought. And you know what? He's healthy now because we didn't give up. Ellie looked at Bo, then back at Carolyn. So, if I believe everything can get better? Always, Carolyn gently replied. This meeting was not the only one. People began to come to the ranch more and more often, some for Bo, some for Carolyn's advice, and some just to be inspired by their story. Samuel, initially skeptical of the unexpected attention, gradually understood that this could help not only other people but also their family. Visitors offered help, some brought feed, and some donated money. The ranch came back to life. "You know," Samuel said to Carolyn one evening as they sat on the porch, "I thought Bo would be our loss. But he became our hope." Carolyn nodded, looking at Bo peacefully walking in his paddock. "He was always more than just a horse," she said. "He's our family." By the 4th month, the battle for Bo had become an integral part of life at Sunny Plain Ranch. Carolyn had grown accustomed to tense days and almost sleepless nights. However, now hope had taken the place of fear. Each day brought small improvements, and Bo, although slowly, was recovering. His steps became more confident, and his appetite returned. The family began to believe in the miracle. Even Samuel, who initially considered the treatment futile, began to devote more time to the horse. He even insisted on expanding the paddock so that Bo would have more space for training. "This place should be comfortable for him," he said one day, tightening a bolt on a new section of the fence. "If he decided to fight, then we should help him." Carolyn looked at her father in surprise. Her strict and sometimes cynical parent had changed. She saw that Bo had become more than just an old horse to him, a symbol of something greater, hope in the most difficult situations. One of the most important events was Bo's first full walk outside the paddock. Carolyn decided it was time to take him to the river, where he used to love spending time. This was risky, but she felt it would help him regain confidence. Samuel and Jamie accompanied her, just in case Bo got tired. The horse cautiously stepped over the grass, each step requiring effort, but he did not stop. Carolyn walked beside him, holding his halter, and spoke softly to him. "You're doing great, Bo," she said. "I'm proud of you. We're almost there." When they reached the river, Bo stopped and raised his head. His nostrils flared, inhaling the scent of water and fresh grass. Carolyn noticed how he relaxed. This place seemed to awaken old memories in him. "Come on, buddy," she whispered, gently nudging him forward. And Bo did something no one expected. He lowered his head to the water and began to drink. This was a simple moment, but for Carolyn it meant everything. Bo had returned to what he loved, and this was the first step in his full rehabilitation. Despite the successes, there were still difficult days.